There are names that echo through the halls of time, names that become more than just a signature on a film poster or a line in the credits. Anthony Hopkins is one of those names. For decades, he has been the face of genius, the voice of gravitas, the soul behind some of the most unforgettable characters ever to grace the screen. But what happens when the applause fades, when the lights dim, and the world's most celebrated actor is left alone with his memories? At 87, Anthony Hopkins stands at a crossroads that few ever reach, a place where the weight of a lifetime presses down with both pride and pain. This is not just a story of fame or fortune. It is a story of survival, of heartbreak, of resilience, and of the quiet moments that define a man far more than any Oscar ever could. From the very beginning, Anthony Hopkins was marked by a sense of otherness. Born in the small Welsh town of Margam, he was the only child of Richard, a baker, and Annie, a homemaker whose gentle hands held the family together. Theirs was a life of honest work and quiet struggle, a world where dreams seemed as distant as the stars. Young Anthony was a solitary child, more comfortable with the keys of a piano or the pages of a sketchbook than with the laughter of classmates. School was a battlefield, and he was often on the losing side. Teachers dismissed him as slow, classmates ignored him, and the echo of loneliness became his constant companion. I was hopeless at school. I was called stupid. I had no friends. I felt like an outsider. He would later recall, the words carrying the weight of wounds that never fully healed. Yet, in the silence of those early years, something extraordinary began to take root. Art became his refuge, a secret world where he could be anyone, go anywhere, feel anything. At 12, he discovered the piano, its melodies offering a language more honest than words. He painted with a fury that surprised even himself, filling the emptiness with color and sound. It was not just a pastime, it was a lifeline. And then, at 14, fate intervened. He met Richard Burton, another son of Port Talbot, who had already conquered the world of stage and screen. For Hopkins, this was more than a chance encounter. It was a revelation. If Burton could rise from the same streets, breathe the same air, and become a legend, then perhaps greatness was not so far away after all. But the journey from lonely child to global icon was anything but smooth. Every step forward was shadowed by doubt, every triumph haunted by the fear of being unworthy. After graduating from the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama and serving 2 years in the British Army, Hopkins entered the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London. There, the boy who once felt invisible began to forge himself into an actor of terrifying intensity. But the process was brutal. Each lesson was a test, each rehearsal a trial by fire. The self-doubt of his school years never left him. It simply changed its mask, waiting for him in the wings, whispering that he would never be enough. The National Theatre of Great Britain, under the legendary Laurence Olivier, became his crucible. Surrounded by giants, Hopkins often felt like an imposter, a pretender who would soon be unmasked. Each night demanded perfection, and failure felt like a public execution. When Olivier fell ill and Hopkins was thrust into the lead role in Dance of Death, it could have been a disaster. Instead, it was destiny. His performance was electric, a force of nature that left audiences trembling and critics scrambling for superlatives. In that moment, the silence that had once suffocated him was shattered forever. Yet, even as the world began to take notice, the shadows lingered. The applause was loud, but the loneliness was louder. The boy from Port Talbot had become a man of the stage, but inside, he was still searching for a place to belong. The journey was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The world of cinema soon opened its doors to Anthony Hopkins, and with it came a new set of challenges and temptations. In 1968, he made his mark as Richard the Lionheart in The Lion in Winter, a performance that announced to the world that his genius could not be confined to the stage alone. Yet, as the world began to celebrate him as a rising star, inside he remained restless, still chasing the approval he had never found in childhood, carrying a hunger no applause could ever fill. The world saw triumph, but he often lived torment. The paradox of being celebrated by millions yet tormented within haunted his brightest years. It was during these years that a dangerous companion began to appear: alcohol. At first, it was just a glass to calm the nerves, to quiet the echo of doubt. But as nights turned into years, the glass lingered longer in his hand, planting seeds of a struggle that would one day nearly destroy him. The bottle became both a friend and a traitor, offering comfort while tightening its grip with merciless hands. Hopkins would later describe those years as a blur, a fog that stole his memory, drained his strength, and blurred entire days into nothingness. "I drank because it was my way of dealing with life. I had no idea how to live," he admitted with painful candor. What looked like triumph to the world was, behind closed doors, a man dissolving into his own oblivion. By the mid-1970s, the spiral had become merciless. Days on set stretched endlessly into nights, and when the cameras stopped rolling, Hopkins found no rest. Mornings arrived not with clarity, but with confusion. Memories fractured, hours missing, his body drained of strength. His health wavered, his energy withered, and the home he had built collapsed beneath the weight of absence and neglect. His first marriage cracked open, and the fragile bond with his daughter slipped further from his grasp. Alcohol was no longer an escape. It was a thief, stealing not just his nights, but his future. He moved through life in a haze of blackouts and regret. A man visible to the world, yet vanishing to himself. Then came one night, a winter awakening. He opened his eyes to find himself behind the wheel of a car with no memory of how he had gotten there. The cold reality struck like a blade. He could have lost everything: his career, his family, perhaps even his life. That was the bottom, the abyss staring back with merciless eyes. And in that abyss he heard it at last, a voice within, faint but unrelenting, commanding him to stop, warning that if he did not, nothing would remain. In December 1975, Hopkins chose to stop. He walked into a support meeting, frightened, uncertain, desperate. From that day forward, he began the long road of sobriety. He embraced the fragile but unbreakable philosophy of one day at a time, clinging to each sunrise as a chance to choose life again. "It's been a miracle," he would later say. "I can't believe it. That one day at a time I've stayed sober." The man who once felt powerless discovered a discipline greater than drink, the discipline of survival. Every day without alcohol became a victory. Every year a mountain climbed. And as decades passed, he guarded his sobriety with the same ferocity that defined his art. Yet the scars remained. The distance with his daughter Abigail, born of those lost years, never truly healed. Hopkins confessed, "I don't have any contact with her. It's her choice. Life is life." That wound, carried quietly, remains one of the most painful reminders that even triumph over the bottle cannot rewrite the past. Still, he speaks of it not with bitterness, but with acceptance. A sober man who has learned to carry the weight of his own humanity. Through it all, he never hid his journey. Hopkins has stood before others struggling with addiction, offering words not wrapped in grandeur but raw truth. Sobriety is not a conquest, but a fragile daily gift. "I'm just a lucky man. I believe we are capable of anything, no matter how lost we feel." His survival became his message, his truth. The story of Anthony Hopkins is not just one of personal demons and private victories. It is also a tale of relentless artistry, of a man who poured every ounce of pain, discipline, and longing into his craft. As the years passed, his performances only grew deeper, more nuanced, more devastatingly human. The world saw the results on screen, but few understood the cost. Fame for Hopkins was a double-edged sword. The higher he climbed, the lonelier the summit became. Success demanded endless hours on set, days that bled into nights, a body pushed to exhaustion, meals skipped, and sleep sacrificed to the machinery of fame. The world saw brilliance, but Hopkins often felt only the grind of a schedule that devoured his strength. He once confessed with brutal honesty, "Fame is nothing. Success is nothing. They don't fill you up." And when the cameras stopped, when the photographs ceased flashing and the handshakes dissolved, he returned to a room that was empty, a silence that no ovation could reach. He admitted that fame never quieted the gnawing doubts or erased the feeling of being an outsider. This paradox of being celebrated by millions, yet tormented within, haunted his brightest years. And it was in those shadows that the bottle, once a quiet companion, began to call more insistently. Still, his artistry soared. Hopkins showed a range that few actors could touch. From servants burdened by duty to artists aflame with madness, to kings, priests, and ordinary men crushed beneath extraordinary weight, he inhabited each role with a truth that was both unsettling and magnetic. And when most of his peers faded into memory, he roared again. In The Father, at the age of 83, he portrayed a man unraveling into dementia. The performance was devastating, tender, and unbearably real, earning him another Academy Award and making him the oldest actor ever to claim Best Actor. In that role, Hopkins transformed vulnerability into universality, turning the fracture of memory into poetry. It was not mere acting. It was a lifetime of pain, discipline, and resilience distilled into art. Even television could not contain him. In Westworld, Hopkins embodied Dr. Robert Ford with chilling precision, proving that age had not dimmed his intensity. Each role was another summit, another mountain conquered, and the legend of his craft grew ever higher. Yet beneath all the brilliance, the paradox endured. The man who stood in the center of global admiration often returned to silence. The solitude of a room emptied after the cameras had gone. The flash of the spotlight could not banish the darkness that waited at home. And it was in that cruel contrast between the roar of ovation and the echo of loneliness that his most dangerous battle took root. For what the world hailed as glory, Hopkins too often lived as emptiness. And emptiness has a way of seeking its own company in a bottle. The world saw Anthony Hopkins, standing at the peak of his craft, bathed in the blinding light of applause. But inside, another story was unfolding, a story drenched in shadows and silence. The emptiness that fame could not erase soon found its false comfort in the bottle. At first it was a companion, a quiet friend promising relief, but it became a traitor, tightening its grip with merciless hands. Hopkins would later describe those years as a blur, a fog that stole his memory, drained his strength, and blurred entire days into nothingness. Yet, through it all, he never stopped creating. He never stopped searching for meaning, for connection, for a sense of home. The stage gave him recognition, but it cost him the one audience that mattered most, his own family. The applause of the world could never drown out the silence of a daughter's absence. Fame could never substitute for the word father. And even 2 Oscars, even a knighthood, could not erase the truth that some wounds never heal. They remain raw, unhealed, unspoken. Etched into the heart of a man who learned too late that greatness in art does not guarantee greatness at home. After the wreckage of his first marriage, Anthony Hopkins found in Jennifer Linton what seemed to be a lifeline, a calm presence, a patient hand reaching through the storm. In those first years, friends recalled a new softness in him. Hopkins smiled more easily. Laughter slipped into rooms once heavy with silence. Jennifer's warmth steadied him, and together they built a home that, though simple, glowed with a fragile peace. There were no fireworks, no grand spectacles, but there was comfort in the ordinary. Meals shared quietly, evenings spent in calm, the subtle joy of two people choosing stability over chaos. For Hopkins, who had spent so much of his youth burning bridges and wandering through self-doubt, this was more than a marriage. It was a fragile redemption, a second chance at the family he feared he might never truly have. But happiness built on fragile ground rarely lasts. Hopkins's career soared higher, pulling him into long shoots, late nights, endless travel that blurred into exhaustion. The bottle, though no longer his nightly storm after 1975, left its ghosts, the restlessness, the distance, the walls he built inside himself. Jennifer endured it all with quiet dignity, becoming the anchor in a life that drifted constantly toward absence. Yet even anchors, when left in cold waters too long, begin to corrode. What they lacked together was not wealth, not comfort, but the heartbeat of a child. Year after year, the silence of their home grew heavier, the empty space at the table more pronounced. For Jennifer, the absence of a child was not simply an empty crib. It was a grief without language, an ache that deepened with each birthday that never came, each lullaby never sung. She had given her best years, her youth, and still had no small hand to hold, no promise of shared old age. For Hopkins, the void was different, but no less devastating. He admitted years later, almost with wariness, "I'm not good at relationships. I withdraw." That distance, that retreat into himself, was not only with his wife, but with the idea of fatherhood itself. The absence of children was not something he argued over or lamented publicly. It was something he carried silently, another echo of the loneliness that had shadowed him since childhood. Work gave him applause, but applause cannot replace a child's voice. Fame filled his days, but nights still returned him to silence. He once reflected that he often felt like an outsider, even in his own home, a confession that revealed just how wide the gulf had grown between them. So their marriage, from the outside so stable, was inside a house with walls slowly hollowed by silence. Love did not erupt in anger. It dissolved in absence. It was not betrayal or scandal that undid them, but the quieter tragedies, distance, exhaustion, and the unbearable weight of dreams left unfulfilled. By 2002, after nearly 3 decades, the marriage ended. Not in scandal, not in fury, but in silence. And perhaps that silence was the cruelest cut of all. To spend 30 years beside someone, sharing seasons, growing older together, only to discover there is no way forward. This is its own kind of devastation. It is not the sudden wound of betrayal, but the slow bleed of absence. A heartbreak that leaves no dramatic scene, yet etches scars that never fade. Jennifer had given her youth, her patience, her hope. She had poured 30 years into holding together a life, with a man admired by millions, but often absent in his own house. What she received in return was not betrayal, but solitude. The kind of solitude that hollows out even the strongest spirit. Hopkins, knighted and celebrated, stood once again alone. Living proof that even the longest marriages can wither when distance becomes the only constant. This second marriage was not a headline-grabbing catastrophe, but in its endurance and its quiet collapse, it revealed a harsher truth, that not all tragedies come with fire and fury. Sometimes the most devastating fractures are the ones that fade slowly, almost invisibly, until there is nothing left to hold on to. After decades of storms, broken marriages, estranged family ties, and the long shadows of loneliness. Anthony Hopkins finally found what he had searched for all along: not more applause, not another stage, but a home. In 2003, at the age of 65, he married Stella Arroyave, a Colombian-born artist whose presence was not heavy with expectation, but light with joy. She was not a remnant of his past, nor a chapter left unfinished, but his redemption. Where others endured his absences, Stella brought presence. Where silence once haunted his houses, she filled the rooms with music and laughter. And where Hopkins had so often felt like an outsider in his own life, she offered him the most radical gift of all: belonging. Their marriage was not painted in headlines or scandal, but in the softer hues of constancy. There were no children together, no second chances at fatherhood. Yet within that absence lay a quiet freedom. The freedom to love without the weight of what might have been, to measure happiness not in obligations unmet, but in moments fully lived. Hopkins has spoken of Stella with unguarded affection, calling her a source of energy, positivity, and balance. In her company, sobriety no longer felt like a burden, but like a celebration. Age no longer felt like decline, but like a season of peace. She did not arrive as a savior. His battles were already fought. She simply walked beside him, ensuring that he would never face the shadows alone again. For Hopkins, who once chased greatness as if it were the only cure for emptiness, Stella became the proof that greatness at home can be simple. A shared breakfast by the window. A walk in the garden where sunlight turned the ordinary into the extraordinary. An evening at the piano where Hopkins played not for audiences, but for the woman who listened with quiet devotion. He would later reflect that he had finally learned to be grateful, to treasure the ordinary moments that fame could never replicate. The restless ambition that once consumed him gave way to stillness. Painting in his studio, improvising melodies on the piano. Speaking of happiness not in golden statues, but in mornings that began and ended with his wife. This third marriage stands as the quiet triumph of his personal life. In a world that will forever remember him as Hannibal Lecter, as Stevens in The Remains of the Day, as the father unraveling in The Father, Hopkins himself insists that the role he cherishes most is simply being Stella's husband. There are no headlines here, no drama, only healing, only the calm endurance of love chosen freely and renewed with each passing day. And peace, when it finally came, did not arrive with fanfare, but with the quiet weight of meaning. The chaos and fractures of the past had carved deep scars. Yet those very scars taught Hopkins the measure of stillness. He knew what absence felt like, so presence became sacred. He had lived through silence heavy with loneliness, so laughter at his table became a kind of miracle. For a man who had once searched for worth on stages and in strangers' applause, Stella's companionship revealed the truest triumph: that happiness, once nearly lost, could be found again, guarded fiercely and cherished as the rarest gift. And so even the loneliest journey, scarred though it may be, can end not in emptiness but in home. Fate, it seems, was not finished testing him. Even after sobriety, after love, after the peace of home, Anthony Hopkins was reminded again and again of how fragile safety can be, how quickly fire can turn walls into ash. The first time came in the early 2000s, when his London home was reduced to embers. Flames rose without warning, racing across beams and ceilings before anyone could react. In less than an hour, what had taken decades to gather, furniture worn by use, rare paintings collected with care, beloved books heavy with notes, photographs yellowed by time, the small tokens of memory that make a house a life, was devoured. The loss was counted not only in millions of pounds, but in the vanished weight of a lifetime reduced to smoke. That alone would have been enough. One inferno to scar a lifetime, one night to etch fire into memory forever. But fate was merciless. In 2018, as wildfires tore through Southern California, flames licked dangerously close to another of his homes. A near miss that felt like destiny, reminding him of its power. And then, in 2025, the nightmare returned in full. At Pacific Palisades, his sanctuary was consumed completely. Once again, flames surged, unstoppable, erasing not just walls and ceilings, but the fragile sense of permanence he had tried so carefully to rebuild. To lose a house once was agony. To lose it twice was devastation beyond words. Hopkins could only watch as walls collapsed and heirlooms shattered in the fire's roar, as if the universe itself were mocking his efforts to hold on to peace. Family treasures, carefully framed scripts, awards, and letters, all gone in a storm of heat and smoke. What remained was silence, but not the silence of loneliness he had once known, the kind that gnawed in his youth and echoed through failed marriages. This was heavier, a silence of absence, of spaces reduced to soot, of rooms echoing only with ghosts of memory. 3 times fire had threatened. Twice it had taken everything, and twice he was forced to stand in the ashes to face the unbearable truth that even the strongest walls can vanish in a breath of flame. For most, a house is only wood and brick. For Hopkins, it was more. It was the canvas on which he painted his second chances, the stage where sobriety grew steadier, the place where ordinary evenings carried the weight of healing. To lose it once was cruel enough. To stand again before a second fire, watching the roof collapse and the walls crumble, as if fate itself were erasing the life he had fought so hard to rebuild, was almost unbearable. He admitted later to the surreal weight of it. How everything from treasured scripts to family heirlooms could vanish in an instant, leaving behind a man stripped bare. And yet in that devastation, there was also clarity. He remembered the smoke choking the air, the frantic rush into the night, the pounding of his own heart as he stumbled into the open, shaken but alive. It was all gone, he recalled, not with bitterness, but with an acceptance forged in scars. Things can be replaced. Life cannot. He was left staring at the ashes with the heavy awareness that though memory had burned, life itself had been spared. It is easy to measure success in trophies or houses, but Hopkins's story of fire reveals another kind of truth. Again and again, he saw what most fear most, the destruction of home, the obliteration of memory in flame. And again, he stood in the ashes, breathing and able to begin again. The man who had once nearly surrendered to the bottle now faced loss with a strange calm, a wisdom tempered by scars. To Hopkins, the fires were not merely tragedies. They were reminders that applause fades, that walls fall, that possessions vanish. But what endures is life itself and the will to rise again. And so, though his homes were taken, Hopkins himself remained unshaken. He rebuilt, he continued, he lived. And when Stella later came into his life, he refused to let fire define him, just as he had once refused to let addiction or despair dictate his ending. For if the stage had taught him anything, it was this: even when curtains fall, another act begins. And from the ashes, he chose to stand. Not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Gratitude for survival, for love, for the chance once more to keep going. Now at 87, Anthony Hopkins lives not on the stage or in the glare of cameras, but in the quiet rhythm of a life he has fought hard to preserve. After the storms of broken marriages, the abyss of addiction, the flames that twice consumed his homes, and the silences of grief, he has built a present defined not by chaos, but by calm. He resides in the United States with his wife Stella, the partner who has stood beside him for more than 2 decades. Together they have created a life of simplicity and resilience, even after the fire of early 2025 forced them once more to rebuild. Hopkins no longer seeks the noise of Hollywood. He seeks privacy, stability, and the laughter that fills his home in the evenings. His health, though marked by age, is tended with the same discipline that once shaped his greatest roles. He accepts the frailty of time, the aching knees, the slower step, but he meets it with dignity. Life is very short, he has often said, and in that brevity, he has found not despair but urgency, a reason to treasure each dawn as a gift, never a guarantee. If his films have ever pierced your heart, if his characters still haunt your dreams, leave a tribute in his honor. Because Anthony Hopkins is not only an actor we admire, he is a testament that against all odds, life itself can still be lived with grace.